Well, welcome to the Heschel Awards Experience session on police accountability in Maryland.
You're muted.
I apologize. Okay, my name is Joanna Silver and I use she, her pronouns. I live in Silver Spring in District 18, and I am a member of JUFJ's Justice System Reform and Immigrants' Rights team. Please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. We have a lot of familiar faces, a lot of old friends with us here tonight, and some new folks. So please go ahead and introduce yourself, and you can say, what district you're zooming in from. So you all heard the introduction about how to choose speaker view. That would be the best way to view this tonight. So please go ahead and do that. And we know you're going to have a lot of questions during this program. If you do have questions, please put your questions. Thank you for the Zoom slide. If you do have questions during the program, please put your questions in the chat and we will keep track of them and answer as many of them as we can. Okay, so why don't we, I will go ahead and introduce our speakers. Our session tonight is going to focus on the 5 legislative priorities identified by the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability, which JUFJ is a member of. Jewish tradition teaches us that destroying one life is akin to destroying an entire world. Yet Black and Brown Marylanders face deadly over-policing and systemic harm every day. JUFJ has been working with coalition partners since 2015 to achieve greater police accountability and to end police violence. But piecemeal and symbolic reform has not been enough. It is clear that Maryland needs bold and meaningful change to the status quo. In the wake of nationwide uprisings following the murder of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, now is the moment for that change. We have 3 amazing speakers tonight who have been central to the fight for police reform in Maryland, and we are grateful to have them here with us. I will briefly introduce each of them, but you can also find their full bios in the Heschel app. So beginning with Yannette Emanuel is the public policy advocate at the ACLU of Maryland. Yannette began her advocacy career as a student at the University of Maryland in College Park. She served as the executive activism chair of the University of Maryland College Park NAACP chapter, as chief of staff for Delegate Angela Angel, and as a policy advocate at the Jobs Opportunities Task Force. Currently, Yannette also serves as the Region 7 adult representative on the NAACP National Youth Works Committee and young adult chair of the Prince George's County NAACP. Davon Love is the director of public policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, which he co-founded in 2010. Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle is a grassroots think tank which advances the public policy interests of Black people in Baltimore through youth leadership development, political advocacy, and autonomous intellectual innovation. As a student at Towson University, Davon gained national attention when he and fellow debater Devin Cooper won the Cross-Examination Debate Association National Championship, the first time in history that an all-Black debate team won that tournament. Davon is also the co-author of the Black Book, Reflections from the Baltimore Grassroots. Captain Joe Perez began his law enforcement career in 1995, eventually serving as commander of the Internal Affairs Division of the Prince George's County Police Department. He currently serves as the assistant commander of the department's Planning and Research Division. Captain Perez was previously the president of the Hispanic National Law Enforcement Association, and since 2014, he has been the chapter president of the Hispanic American Police Commanders Officers Association, National Capital Region. Our panelists will begin by sharing a bit about the 5 Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability demands and why they are needed. While this is going on, we invite you to post questions in the chat. We'll either share them with the speakers during their presentations or in a Q&A period after their formal remarks. And we also have someone who will be monitoring the chat to see if she can answer some of the questions for you as we go along. In the last 5 minutes, JUFJ staff will tell you about next steps in our advocacy work and how you can get involved. Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and look at the 5 demands and just go over them quickly before our speakers begin. Okay, so there are 5 coalition demands. The first is to repeal the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, otherwise known as LEOBOR. The second is to restore control of the Baltimore Police Department to Baltimore City residents. The third is a demand that investigations into police misconduct must be transparent. The fourth is to limit the use of force by law enforcement. And the fifth is to remove law enforcement from schools. So we're going to begin with Davon. I want to make sure he is on.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, wonderful. Great. Thank you so much. Can you talk to us first, kick us off with a discussion of LEOBOR, the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, and why the coalition wants to repeal this law?
So the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights is a statute that was codified in 1974. And it essentially provides a variety of protections above and beyond really their constitutional rights. And so one of the things I want to add just as a historical note is that Maryland is the first state to enact the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights in 1974. And in fact, on the Eastern Shore in 1975, there was a conference convened by the FOP that invited fraternal orders of police around the country to essentially model fraternal law enforcement officer Bill of Rights around the United States. So I just think it's important, just given the national context. When you think about George Floyd in a place like Minnesota that have a law enforcement officer Bill of Rights, as a really important connection there. As I mentioned, it provides protections for law enforcement that really impede the ability to hold law enforcement accountable. And so it includes things like only sworn law enforcement can participate in the investigation of an alleged act of misconduct or brutality by a police officer. It places limits on the extent to which non-police officers, civilians can participate in discipline of police officers that engage in misconduct, and a variety of other things. Officers have 5 days before they're required to make a statement on the record about an incident that they were involved in that resulted in misconduct. One of the things that I think is going to be very important to kind of lay out is that LEOBR, the statute, in many respects operates very much like a labor agreement. And in fact, it's labor, which is the frame that often the FOP uses to justify the LEOBR. And, one of the things that we want to make sure that the listeners on this call are clear about is that the LEOBR provides a level of protection that, supersedes that which many public employees get. Right. And so a big part of the advocacy that you'll see from my organization and the coalition that's formed around these issues is to look at the way in which we can actually align the same rights that other public employees get to law enforcement without the kinds of impediments to accountability and transparency that have, perpetuated the issues of brutality and misconduct. And I guess the last thing I'll say on LEOBR is that a big part of what we'll be doing during the General Assembly is developing a standard for discipline that can go across the different agencies around the state so that it takes it off the table for collective bargaining. Because a part of what FOPs have done around the state is that they've actually taken parts of the LEOBR statute and have actually put it in their collective bargaining contracts. And so that's why it's so important for us in our repeal to make sure that we are able to substitute it with a standard of discipline such that local fraternals or orders of police cannot collectively bargain more kind of control, repressive kinds of provisions in their contract.
So I don't know if Captain Perez wants to jump in at all here, but one of the things that folks were asking a lot about is like, what would replace LEOBR? Is that what you're referring to, Davon, is replacement language? Can you give a little more detail about what that replacement language might look like?
Right. So essentially, what we have is a system where if an officer is disciplined by the police chief, they have the ability to opt for a trial board. And, as we've kind of alluded to, traditionally those trial boards are made up almost exclusively of other law enforcement. And it's a process by which really disempowers the police chief and really empowers the FOP to have a lot of control, the nature of how discipline operates within police departments. And so a part of what we're looking to do is to, have language in the LEOBR repeal. But again, model, so basically, if you look at the state statute around state personnel and pensions, it lays out in many respects kind of a progressive discipline. And it gives, a list of the kinds of things that an agency head can terminate an employee for, right? Which is one of the things that police chiefs don't have the power to terminate officers who they find to engage in in brutality and the like. And so that's a part of it. And then the other important piece of the replacement language is to allow for jurisdictions through a local ordinance to establish oversight bodies that have investigatory and disciplinary power over the decisions around law enforcement. And I think that's particularly important because I think the biggest deterrent to police corruption is for the community to have the ability to see what police are doing and to have the ability to discipline.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I think we're going to shift to Yannette and ask if she can, if you can address the local control issue. What is local control? Why does Baltimore need it returned to them?
Thank you. So I can do that. So local control. Baltimore City is the only jurisdiction in Maryland in which the city's police agency, which is the 8th largest police department in the entire country, is considered not a city agency, which deprives Baltimore City Council of any political accountability or control over that agency. Some interesting history about how Baltimore became a state, Baltimore City Police Department became a state agency really dates back to about 159 years ago. In response to the rise of the Know Nothing Party in Baltimore City. The Know Nothings were a party of white Protestants who are anti-immigrant and anti-Black. In the mid-1800s, Baltimore's free Black population was growing and immigrants were continuing to settle in the city. Between 1840 and 1860, over 2 million Irish and German immigrants came to the US, where the total population was just over 20 million. And between 1830 and 1860, Baltimore's population increased from 80,000 to 212,000, with nearly 25% being foreign born by 1860. As a result, the Know Nothing Party engaged in a lot of voter fraud and suppression because they believed that the German and Irish immigrants were coming to take their jobs. Between 1856 and 1860, Thomas Swan was a mayor and began his political career as a Know Nothing. And by 1860, the Know Nothing Party had actually taken complete political control of Baltimore City, relying on violence and coercion. The Maryland General Assembly reached the conclusion that the city and the mayor had proven themselves incapable of maintaining order in the city of Baltimore. And in fact, the hiring of and firing of power, which the mayor has today, was only established in 1976 as a result of the 1968 uprisings in Baltimore City. So the power is, that power is the only direct control the city has over the BPD. Yet currently it is the city and its taxpayers who are entirely responsible for funding the BPD's budget and the local government isn't able to govern that department. So this deprives Baltimore City Council of any political accountability or control over that agency. And as a matter of just democratic political accountability is exactly why BPD should be restored back to the control of Baltimore City's elected representatives.
So this is a whole big other area, but I would love to see if you can, in a nutshell, try to explain to folks how this local control issue relates to the consent decree that the Department of Justice has with Baltimore City at this moment.
Well, if Baltimore City does not, to my understanding, and Davon can correct me if I'm wrong, is that if Baltimore City doesn't have control over the department, then they're not able to actually implement some of the recommendations that were recommended through the consent decree. So, in addition to the fact that Baltimore City being the only majority Black jurisdiction in the state of Maryland doesn't have control. When we have things like a consent decree, they're unable to implement some of those policies without going to the General Assembly. And
I can just quickly add to what Yannette just said that, the consent decree is really centered around internal policy of Baltimore City's police department. That's what it has jurisdiction to impact. And a part of what that means for the local Baltimore city government is that the city council doesn't have the ability by ordinance to set policy on the local police department. All that would have to go to the state legislature, which is part of the disconnect.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much for explaining that. So I think we are going to shift to MPIA. I know we're moving quickly tonight, but we have so many important issues to make sure everyone understands so that they can take action on all of them. So we're going to switch to the Maryland Public Information Act. And I do want to make sure that Captain Perez can share his personal experiences, but I want to start with Davon and ask if you can explain the ways that the MPIA is a barrier to police transparency and accountability, and explain exactly what the coalition wants to see changed about it.
Absolutely. So if you read the 2016 Department of Justice report on the Baltimore City Police Department, there's a section that actually looks at many of the problems with the internal mechanisms of investigation of law enforcement. And you find some really egregious stories of complaints that were made, internal investigations that were done that resulted in no discipline. And in fact, the kind of major categories of those internal affairs investigations are sustained or unsustained. So unsustained means there's no basis there's no ability to act on it. And didn't find enough information to warrant discipline. Sustained means that the findings, of the complaint are correct. And that's important because what we're interested in is that we're interested in getting access to the internal affairs investigatory files, such that the community, the public has access to it. So in the Maryland Public Information Act, as I'm sure many of your listeners are aware, you can make public information requests to your government, right? Well, there's certain things that are in categories that are not accessible to the public. And so the internal investigatory or the internal affairs investigations and documents that are related to that are in a category of which they cannot be disclosed to the public. And so when you read the DOJ report, one of the things that you'll find is that if these files were available to the public, it would provide information that would have been necessary for the community to be proactive about pressuring the police department to get rid of officers that have a pattern of police abuse and misconduct. And so what we're arguing for this coming session is that those files of internal affairs investigations be available via PIA requests to the public.
Great, thank you. Captain Perez, do you want to talk a little bit about your personal experience in internal affairs and what that's taught you about why we need to reform MPIA?
Yes, thank you. First of all, what Davon is saying is absolutely correct. It's important that internal affairs files be made public. Right now, they're categorized as personnel files. So that's how the police department gets around not revealing those files. And the reason why they should be released is because many times the officers that you read about in the newspapers that are, killing folks or injuring folks, that's not their first time. I can guarantee you that based on my experience in internal affairs, those officers that are involved in those high profile incidents, they got many more before it. And the problem is that the police departments have the ability to cover these files under that personnel file. And if they were made public and they would have to reveal these investigations, we would be able to, catch these officers a lot sooner. The public, would be aware of these officers. And in turn, it would pressure the leadership of the police department to actually take action and not cover up for these officers. And one of the things that I learned in internal affairs was that it's only about 10% of a police department that usually has the complaints. It's always the same 10% of officers, you know. So this will just help to hold the police chief accountable to the public by revealing the files.
That's great. And I apologize if, Davon, I don't know if you addressed this, but one of the things that I've always been struck by when I hear testimony in Annapolis on the MPIA is that like painful experience of having filed a complaint against a police officer and then like never actually being able to know what happened in your own case when there was harm done to you. Can you, either of you address that piece of the MPIA puzzle?
So in the DOJ report, there's actually a very interesting example that they give. Let's see if I can find it right now. But there's a account where there's a incident where a resident, you know, an older Black gentleman, files a complaint against an officer who insisted on who was strip searching this person just randomly over a period of several months. And so they file a complaint. He files a complaint. There's a bunch of information given that matches that of the person's actual complaint. It matches the location where, you know, he said it was happening, matches the description of the officer, matches other kinds of complaints made against the officer. And that complaint was put in the category of unsustained, right? That investigation, the you know, end of it was that didn't warrant any discipline. So I just use that example. If you go through the DOJ report, you just have lots of examples of complaints that were filed that had all the proper information, but it wasn't acted on.
And if I could just add to that, and just give some more examples as to why it's really critical that we have access to both sustained and unsustained complaints. Around 90% of complaints made by the public are unsustained. Just for a more recent example, in Prince George's County, what we've discovered through our lawsuit against the Prince George's County Police Department is that in the last 3 to 4 years, there have been almost 7,000 use of force complaints filed. And 96.8% of those were found unsustained or deemed justified. And so there's no transparency in what they looked into in those investigations, who they talked to, anything like that. It's just that it was unsustained or found justified. And so, but in addition to that, another reason why it's critical that we have access to to these complaints is because we could potentially prevent people from Black lives being taken in the courtrooms as well, not just in the streets, but also in the courtroom. So in Maryland, 80% of exonerees are Black, and officer misconduct is a leading cause. A single case in Baltimore, a single Baltimore detective, Robert Patton, was involved in 4 wrongful convictions that cost Maryland taxpayers over $22 million in state compensation and civil lawsuits. So, you know, in addition to preventing them from killing people, we also need to be able to prevent them from a number of wrongful convictions happening as well.
I so appreciate that you mentioned that, Yanette, because in my professional world as a public defender, I see this all the time. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, you know, police officers are like the primary and often the only witnesses against defendants in criminal trials. And those defendants and their lawyers can't even get access to these records most of the time. We have a little more access than the public, but the MPIA also prevents defendants from getting records of the people who are testifying against them at trial. And so it really does have a significant impact. Thank you for highlighting that. Okay, so I think we're going to move on. Do any of you have anything else to add on MPIA before we move on to use of force? Okay, so Maryland right now does not have a statewide use of force policy for the police. Montgomery County just kind of passed one, and this coalition believes that one is needed. Yanette, do you want to describe for us specifically what the coalition wants to see here?
Yes, I can do that. And I'd also just like to start by saying that over 1,000 people are killed nationwide annually. And in Maryland, between 2013 and 2019, there have been 128 people killed by police, and 80% of them are Black. I'm sorry, 80 of them are Black. And in these years, Black people accounted for 29% of the state's population and yet make up 63% of the people killed by police. So it's past time that we enact a law to limit police use of force. So under current existing law, what the law looks at is whether whether officers use deadly or not, whether officers use deadly or not objectively reasonable, and the standard is looking from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, which looks at things like the severity of the crime that was an issue, whether the suspect poses an immediate threat to the safety of others, and whether the person that the officer is using force on is actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight. In the context of deadly force, the Supreme Court has held that deadly force is objectively reasonable when the officer has probable cause to believe that the suspect poses significant threat or death or physical injury to the officer or others. But the critical thing to understand is that the reasonableness inquiry is not sufficiently protective of human life and gives officers too much discretion and gives the law too narrow of a lens in judging police behavior. And so what we believe a good use of force policy should have is clear definitions of lethal and non-lethal force. Officers may use lethal force only as a last result after first exhausting reasonable alternatives, and only when it's necessary to protect officers or the public from death or serious injury. And officers may use less than lethal force when it's necessary. And what we mean by necessary is that there is no reasonable alternative. This allows the law to broaden the lens and to look at whether there were other means of dealing with the situation, and requires that those other means be attempted if they are possible. In addition to determining whether an officer's use of force is justified, requires looking at the totality of circumstances around the use of force, including whether the officer used de-escalation techniques, whether the officer's actions increased the need for use of force, and officers must also warn, attempt to de-escalate, and intervene with other officers who are using excessive force as well. As in the case of Leonard Shand, when officers shot him over 44 times just last year in Prince George's County, after they escalated the situation by throwing a flashbang grenade, the goal of the police officers in that situation should have been to resolve situations safely for all involved, not make it worse. In fact, which is exactly what they did. And our use of force bill will also implement new regulations around specific officer behavior, including but not limited to the discharge of a firearm, taser, chokeholds, shooting with a less lethal launcher, and strikes by fist or hard object.
Davon or Captain Perez, do you want to add anything to this? Like, I mean, the Leonard Shand case is one example. I mean, there's so many examples whenever we're in Annapolis. Again, they're like these heartbreaking examples of stories of violence committed against members of our community that seem like were not necessary. I'm wondering if any of you have any specific cases that you want to address, or any other thoughts to share about the why we need to change use of force, and illustrating some of the specific changes we want to see.
I could chime in on this one. You see, I guess part of the problem, and everything ties together, the transparency, the use of force, everything ties together, because what I have seen is that most police administrators believe that heavy-handed policing reduces crime. So what that translates to, these police chiefs like these officers that go out there and what they say is they kick butt and take names later. They like those types of officers and encourage that. So when you have transparency in the investigations, for example, it's a lot harder to cover for these officers when they do something wrong. And then if you have a use of force policy that's clear, again, it's a lot harder for them to cover. And, one of the things we have to get away from in law enforcement is a lot of times in your law enforcement career, you come across an incident where you could have shot at someone, and you would have been justified, but the problem is that they use that as a crutch, because many times you don't have to. I mean, you're justified, but you don't have to shoot. And I personally was involved in at least 3 or 4 incidents where, you know, I was legally justified to shoot, but I chose not to, you know, and no one was killed. I never had to shoot anybody, you know, but that's not the tone that the administrators are setting. And policies like this, like the use of force, the public information, is going to hold people accountable.
And there's another, another case that comes to mind in a family that we've been working closely with, and that's the case of DeMonte Ward Blake, who was pulled over for a traffic ticket. The officer claimed that he smelled marijuana, and he ended up searching him and arresting him while he was already in handcuffs. They say he tried to run away, but we don't really, you know, those details are still unfolded. But what we do know is today he's paralyzed and will probably never walk again because of the excessive force that was used, and nothing can really be justified. The man was in handcuffs. He can't do much in handcuffs. And that, you know, there's also his girlfriend on the scene who argues a different story than the version that the officers told, but not passing these important pieces of legislation have real consequences, and those consequences of specifically affect Black and brown people in the state of Maryland.
Yeah, I think a lot about the Finan Burhe case in Montgomery County, where clearly under the current constitutional law, the officer was justified in shooting him, yet he made that decision within 20 seconds without engaging in any de-escalation attempts, and, you know, clearly not valuing that individual's life. And a law like this seems like it would force a real change and force a change in the calculation that an officer needs to go through before making that life-altering decision. Great. Davon, is there anything that you wanted to add?
Nope, I think they got it.
Okay, great. So the final demand of the coalition is to get police out of our schools. Yanette, do you want to kick this off and explain why this is such a critical issue?
I can do that. Anti-Blackness pervades our society and in policing in America, and it clearly shows up in schools that have police. There were over 3,100 arrests of kids in our schools just last year. In Maryland, Black students receive 56% of school-based arrests statewide, even though they are only about a third of the student population. And even though data demonstrates that Black students misbehave at the same rates as their peers, a child in a school with a police officer is 5 times more likely to be arrested for disorderly conduct and twice as likely to be arrested for a fist fight. The police we assign to our schools are by definition responsible for enforcing the law. So when they see a fight or they see horseplay or in the hallway or a student ride off in another's bike, they don't see a child who needs to be taught, whose brain is still figuring out impulse control, and who doesn't have yet the tools to constructively resolve conflict. They see a person committing second-degree assault, willful disturbance of school activities, or robbery, even if that person is 15, 12, or 18. Police in schools don't make them any schools with police officers in them don't make them any more safe than other schools. And thankfully, the research clearly shows that, and that putting resources into more social workers, school psychologists, counselors, restorative approaches, practitioners, and community school coordinators make a real difference in both safety and positive outcomes for the children, which is what we are trying to achieve this session by removing police officers out of schools and reallocating the $10 million that was funded through the Safe to Learn Act in 2018 into these resources that I just laid out.
Great, thank you. Davon or Captain Perez, do you have anything else to add on the school resource officer demand?
Not a lot, just to say that, you know, I think the importance of this demand is for us to rethink what public safety means. I think we've been socialized in a society to see police as an essential aspect of the world, as how it functions. And anybody that studies non-Western societies, then, you know, there are societies that don't have a word for jail or a word for police because they didn't have them. And so I think a part of what, you know, this demand forces us to do is to rethink what constitutes public safety in a way that's actually effective. And as Yannette mentioned, the data suggests that, school police doesn't make, schools safer. So I think it challenges us to think deeper about what safety actually looks like and how to constitute it.
I really appreciate that framing, because I think that is where so many of us are coming from, like trying to just force this issue of a rethinking of what it means to be safe. And, none of us had school resource officers when we were growing up, and we felt safe in our schools. So that's really helpful to frame it that way. Thank you.
The only other thing I'd like to add is that I failed to mention earlier is that students with disabilities in Maryland receive 30% of school-based arrests, although they only comprise 12% of the student population. So don't want to leave them out.
Now, that's a critical data point, Yannette. Thank you for bringing that to everyone's attention. So I have a bunch of other questions. I think the biggest question that a lot of people have is, we've all been going, and you've all been in Annapolis for years, trying to get these changes made to policing. What are the options? And I think the hope is that things have changed enough nationally that this is now the moment that change could happen. And so what I'd like to ask you all to address is, what are some of the obstacles to our achievement of these goals this year? You could come up with them yourself. One of the big ones I'm interested in understanding, it relates to Leobor and MPIA, is the role of unions in Annapolis. So I don't know if maybe one of you want to kick that piece off. Where the union advocates will align, how do, pro-union folks, which, so many of us are, kind of frame this in our minds and do the right advocacy that we need to protect our community members. I don't know if anyone wants to kick that piece off.
So I could start. One of the things that we heard a lot in the presidential election were the Democrats governing to and trying to curry favor with the suburbs, particularly white folks in suburbs. And that's a particularly important phenomenon when we think about the fact that Maryland is in many respects a Democratic Party stronghold. With the exception of Larry Hogan over the past couple of terms, who in some places would be considered a moderate Democrat. Democrats really control the show here in Maryland. And when we look at many of the issues that the Democrats have moved to become more progressive on, Democrats have become more progressive on issues of LGBTQ, more progressive on issues like education reform. But one of the places where there's certain districts, and we kind of call them purple districts, those places that folks tend to be a bit moderate, and they may be progressive on some of the other issues that I named, but these are places, parts of Baltimore County, parts of Howard County, parts of Harford County, parts of Anne Arundel County. These are places that they may be more liberal on other issues, but on particularly issues of race and criminal justice and public safety, they tend to be more conservative. And the leadership in Annapolis, in many respects, is governing towards them and not towards those who actually make up the majority of the Democratic Party. As Jeanette mentioned, Black folks constitute about 29% of the state's population. Latinx folks are approaching about 14%. And so, it's likely, people of color make up a large percentage of the Democratic Party base. And yet the Democratic Party is governing towards the more conservative part of our state's population as the basis for what kinds of policies get put through. And so the reason why I mention that here is because I think one of the biggest ways folks can help is really think about, who are those folks in your families and your networks who may be progressive on other issues, but on this issue continue to remain conservative, right? Continue to hold on to the mythology of officer friendly, right? That's the basis for how they come to understand, what police are, and push them to think about the fact that the way that law enforcement historically has operated in our communities, and not about individual officers, but about the way the system has perpetuated certain kinds of violence, is going to be important for those constituencies to be pushed and moved so that we can actually move these policies through the General Assembly.
I love that you characterize Harford County as purple, Davon. I wish, but I mean, so that is incredibly valuable advice. And I'm wondering though, I mean, is there a future in which our legislature will govern towards the actual majority of its party and not this minority that has, you know, potentially like the economic power? Or is there, is there something that we can do, particularly this session, to push them in that direction?
Yeah, I would just say I would encourage, you know, this network of people, folks that are on this call, to, you know, be intentional about reaching out to folks who are in those districts that, you know, have Democrats in them, but also have contested, you know, bipartisan elections. You know, in many places, I'm sure Montgomery County, this is true. I know in Baltimore City it's true that our primaries are the only things that matter, right? But I think a part of what has happened in those parts of the state where there is contestation on that front, and I think this is you know, something that progressives generally see on the national front, is instead of going towards the base, the party decides to go towards the center to reach this you know, this bipartisan kind of consensus. And what comes along with it tends to be these issues. These issues becomes the things that get sacrificed in order to pull together this kind of bipartisan consensus, you know, these kind of purple districts that Democrats are capitulating to.
That's helpful. Thank you. Yannette or Captain Perez, do you want to try to take a crack at this? I am interested in the union piece, because I think that's really interesting and complicated.
Well, I like to.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I like to say that I've been going to Annapolis for a couple of years now, testifying for more police accountability and transparency. And, you know, just like the police chiefs that believe that heavy-handed policing is what lowers crime, I think these legislators are also of the same mindset. And they think that by getting rid of the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, you know, that's going to increase crime. By having a use of force policy, that's going to increase crime. And actually, I can tell you for a fact, it's not. We got to go away from the heavy-handed policing back to community policing. I mean, real community policing. And I think by them enacting these modifications and repeals, we'll get there. But I honestly don't think that these legislators are strong enough to say, hey, we got to put our foot down. Too many lives are being lost. You know, too many people are being injured.
Yannette, I want to let you answer, except that since I have Captain Perez here, there are a number of folks who were asking questions about like what the opinion of rank and file officers are about the MPIA. Someone asked like where most Maryland police officers live. Do they live out? Are there a lot of them that live out of state, and how that influences things? So I'm wondering if like maybe you can try to answer those, and then we can move to Yannette.
And they're not really tough questions, but I'll say this. Unfortunately, the opinions of officers go along the lines of race. So if you ask a minority officer what he thinks about a use of force policy, you know, or LEOBA, they're not going to be so upset of the repeal. Where you ask a non-minority officer the same exact question, and you know you would think that you're trying to take one of their children, you know. So it just depends, and I hate to say it, a lot of things go along the lines of race, whether it's, you know, discipline within the police departments. You know, they have no problem if a minority officer does something wrong. I can guarantee you he'll get the discipline that he deserves and some. And we definitely found that out through the lawsuit, where a minority officer that did something wrong was 3 times as likely to get terminated than his Caucasian counterpart. So again, you know, it all goes along by race. When it comes to where officers live, at least in Prince George's County, the majority of the minority officers live in the county, whereas the majority of the Caucasian officers live out of the county, you know, because, you know, it's okay to come into a minority neighborhood, you know, kick butt, take names, and then go back home to, you know, as far as, you know, Harford County or St. Mary's County or whatever. You know. So it's all along the lines of race.
That's an extremely helpful insight for our listeners to hear. So thank you for sharing that, despite how terrible it is. But I really appreciate that. So we're running out of time. I want to let Yannette chime in on the issue of the obstacles that we face right now. And, you know, maybe in answering this question, Yannette, you can also kind of talk about what are some of the counter proposals we're looking at that we need to fight against and standing strong behind our proposals.
Thank you. I'll close just by saying that when the people lead, the leaders follow. And so if all 45 people on this call take it upon themselves to coordinate with 10 people in your district, in your neighborhood, and take on a legislator that hasn't yet signed on, that'll go a long way. And what we know is the majority of these elected officials care mostly about holding their place in office or elevating to higher office. And so if they don't, you know, you have an option in 2 years to fire them. And so how you all approach them and what the people say really is what determines how far we will go with these policies, and we need everyone to chime in. None of these issues are new. These issues have been around for centuries, and the data for decades. And so it's hard to deny. And so what I find myself doing a lot of times is I'm really lobbying to legislators to agree with me that Black lives do matter. And so they tweet it, they post it, they'll have the t-shirts, they'll be at the rallies, but ultimately means nothing if they don't support us this session. And so history is currently being written as we speak. And so what they do this session matters, and we have to hold them accountable to that. We're definitely going to have a lot of opposition from the FOP and the chiefs of sheriffs and others who just, unlike-minded people. And we just need to stay firm in our position. We cannot negotiate or compromise away just to say we got to win. It's all or nothing. And that I think we need to hold that line and be consistent with that messaging with everyone that we're talking to. So things that people can do is there's a public list of all people who have signed on and haven't signed on. Take a look at that list, have your legislator signed on. If not, then you know what your homework and your assignment is. And then also, like Davon mentioned, there's folks in your family or your networks who may be more conservative on these issues. It'll be better received if this message is coming from you than me. And so they need to be hearing from you on where you are on these issues. And it's really your responsibility to be educating them and taking a strong position on these issues. So there's a lot you can do. And I heard a quote recently, is if you don't know, it's because you don't want to know. And so hopefully leaving tonight, you all know exactly what your marching orders are.
That's
And if I can
amazing.
add, and if I could add one more thing, because I wanted to address your point about unions just quickly. I think unions, it's going to be important that folks who have relationships to unions ask them to speak up. There are elements among labor that have some anxieties about this because they think that it'll be a snowball effect. You know, that the FOP has an interest in characterizing our demands as anti-union, anti-labor, anti-collective bargaining. And I think everyone on this call, given the conversation we've had thus far, is clear about the unique role that law enforcement plays and why the protections that we're describing are important. And so I think it'll be important to force labor institutions to make a determination as to where they stand on the issue, because I think behind the scenes, they're going to play a big role for this coming session.
That's great. Thank you so much. I can't thank you, all three of you, enough for sharing your wisdom with us and giving us our marching orders. So I'm actually going to hand it over to Eliana Cooper from the JUFJ staff, and she's going to give a little more detail about the actions that folks here tonight can take to further the policies that we've been talking about.
Yeah, On behalf of everyone at Jews United for Justice, thank you to Davon Love, Yunette Emanuel, Captain Joe Perez, and Joanna Silver for putting together this session, Police Accountability in Maryland. And thank you to everyone here for sharing this time with us. We need your help in urging our state legislators to support these 5 critical demands. And we have an action alert to do just that. We're putting a link to that in the chat right now. It takes just a moment to fill out your contact information, and our system will send an email to your state legislators. We encourage you to fill out this action alert now while we are wrapping up this session. We also want your feedback. We'll be sending you a survey by email and ask you to take the 2 minutes to fill it out. We value your support and your presence with us in this time of COVID and political change. As always, your support is welcome. If you have not already made a gift to support the Heschel Vision experience, please consider investing in Jews United for Justice's programs. You can do so at jufj.org/donate. We're putting a link in the chat. Gifts of every and any size are appreciated. It is thanks to our community support that we can make a difference together. We also hope you'll join us in December. We also encourage you to donate to our partners in this work. We're putting those links in the chat as well. And then lastly, we hope you will join us in December when we meet virtually with state legislators to discuss eviction prevention, renters' rights, and emergency support, as well as these policing demands and the rest of our 2021 legislative agenda. You can find your district and sign up for the meeting with your legislators using the link we are putting in the chat. It's been an adventure to bring the Heschel Vision Awards to our community of supporters virtually. Your participation has made it all worth it. We thank you again for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at another JUJ event and at Heschel next year, hopefully in person. Good night, everyone.